I'm gonna get my cell phone. Okay, perfect. Okay, perfect. So we're now live. We can maybe start. So hello all, and welcome to the 5th episode of Sheltering Places. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's guests. We have Thomas Moynihan and Jason Mohaghegh. Now for a very brief introduction of both of them. Thomas Moynihan is a researcher from the UK. In 2019, he completed a PhD at Oriel College and is currently working with Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute. Through his work, he aims to bring the historical drama of human enlightenment together with the grand ambitions of contemporary futurology so as to update the guiding ideal of human vocation for the billion-year perspectives of modern science. In other words, he spends his time wondering what Kant would have thought about Dyson spheres. Motivating interests include the history of counterfactual imagination, the longest-term history of our grasp of the future, the possibility of ethics and universalism in an astrobiological context, the plausibility of sapient vocation at Kardashev scale, and the age-old riddle, what is enlightenment? Tying all these interests together is a concern for what exactly is demanded of us by our curious position as sapient beings within an otherwise seemingly silent universe. He has published Spinal Catastrophism on Urbanomic and has an upcoming title in the works, X-Risk, How Humanity Discovered Its Extinction, also on Urbanomic, I think later this year, if I'm not mistaken. Jason Mohaghegh is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Babson College and Programmer of Transdisciplinary Studies at the New Centre for Research and Practice. His scholarly focus is upon tracking currents of experimental thought between the Middle East and West, with particular attention to exploring the concepts of chaos, violence, illusion, silence, madness, futurism, disappearance, and apocalyptic aesthetics. He has published several books to date, including The Chaotic Imagination, New Literature and Philosophy of the Middle East in Palgrave Macmillan, Inflictions, The Writings of Violence in the Middle East in Continuum, Omnicide, Mania, Fatality, and Future in Delirium in Urbanomic, and Night, A Philosophy of the After Dark in Zero Books. He is also the co-editor of the Suspensions book series with Bloomsbury Press and the co-director of the fifth Disappearance Left. So without further ado, thank you very much for being here today, Jason and Thomas. And the subject that brings us here today is about the question of global catastrophe and how this is related to both terms, terms I have personally chosen that could be related to global catastrophism, that is insurrection and extinction. So I would like to pose a first question to both of you. That would be the following. Our historical context appears to be one of global catastrophe. This catastrophe might be placed both at the level of human systems of representation in praxis and thought. This in relation to the failure of an effective enactment of dissident politics and the collapse of freedom of choice in the democratic electoral systems leading to authoritarian governance. And at the level of our own extraction and abuse of the material resources available on Earth. From the above, could we draw an account of the limited experiences produced by this global catastrophe, such as human insurrection and human extinction, and to which ludics and strategy could be applied in order to lay down possibilities for the future of our human collective? Can we draw our collective destiny as the elaboration of a cosmic gamble, where we have the choice to bet to the highest stakes and assume responsibility toward ourselves in order to complexify our status as humans? Or will we ultimately decide to renounce to this responsibility in order to be swallowed by the drab sludge of non-existence? So I would like to know if Jason or Thomas would be willing to answer this multifold question first.
I'm happy to start us off if you'd like that. I think that when we're talking about games and gambling, the first question that we need to ask ourselves is whether this existence is our game or if we're in its game, meaning the game of another. Deleuze has this ominous talk where he tells us to, quote, beware the other's dream, because if you're caught in the other's dream, you're done for. And I wonder if we can extend this logic also to waking up in someone else's game. What we call so-called existence, are we playing for it, with it, against it? On whose home field or in whose labyrinth is the game taking place? It seems that two camps have developed in modern thought. On the one side, you have the being in the world thinkers who treat this realm as a dwelling, kind of an authentic dwelling place for us. And then you have the more sinister world without us configuration, who constantly speak about the indifference and anonymity of the universe. But few seem to consider what I've always thought is the more elusive and aggressive possibility, which is our being against the world. What if the more fascinating implication is to contemplate an existence that's out to get us, and thus compelling us to react more adversarially with the world as a cutthroat or nemesis or opponent of a game? So for that, I just have a quick breakdown, kind of an intricate breakdown of different dimensions of games. There are game archetypes, games of skill, games of chance, games of role-playing, games of sensation. But I had my own sort of schematic that I just wanted to share, and hopefully Tom and whoever else can improvise and elaborate at will. Federico, if you have that quick slide.
Sure. Just give me 1 second.
Sure.
And we'll be sharing this slide. Perfect. So can you currently see the slide on your screens?
Yes. So,
okay.
Hold on a second here. So you'll notice then is that the first game dimension on the left side column are games of endurance. And that's just where the game's objective is simply to hold on for as long as you can before eventual defeat. So it's a test of withstanding surrender. And there's an old saying in a lot of various cultures that our relation to mortality itself is like playing a great game master. You're inevitably destined to lose, but you still want to give it a good game. So examples of these endurance games are things like the rodeo, where they count the seconds before a rider is kicked off the bull, or children spinning in circles until they fall dizzy to the ground, or at a more cosmic level, the prediction of the red giant sun, where supposedly in 5 billion years, the star's outer layers will consume the Earth and other other planets, and they'll scorch the oceans. And if you notice, we even in most cultures marvel at those people of exceptional old age as if lasting were an accomplishment in and of itself. So just simply hanging on for prolonged periods of time gives us a kind of unconscious sense that we perceive the world as a game of endurance. Then the next category is games of cheating. That's where you can circumvent rules or skip stages. Interestingly, piracy has this built into its very cultural substructure. So sidestepping, theft, deception, betrayal, these are all assumed parameters of play. And you notice that people also often like to unconsciously conceptualize death in this manner too, meaning that everybody walks around with some delusion of invincibility, convinced deep down that they're going to be the only one to somehow live forever, and they're going to cheat death by some stroke of luck. You've got games of unclear progress. That's where it's not apparent whether you're winning or losing until it's too late and the result is officially revealed. So that's lotteries, for instance, follow this criterion of instantaneous announcement. You know, you buy the ticket, you wait a while, and then you're in obscurity the entire time until the climactic day arrives. You've got games of self-endangerment. That's where it's expected that you have to forfeit game piece tokens along the way, or even sometimes move towards the direction of peril. And there are theories of hunting that are based on this, that the only way that the hunted can confuse the traces and elude the hunter is by doubling back and moving towards the direction of danger. There are games of sudden shifts. That's where you're losing the whole time until a miraculous comeback at the last moment. So in casino talk, that's like the slot machine where you hit the jackpot. You've been pouring coins in all day and then suddenly you get the jackpot, or vice versa. That's where one abrupt turn leads to the depletion of your entire fortune. So you've been amassing sort of chips. That's like in the game of craps, you know, with the dice. And that's where you let it ride. So it doesn't matter that you've had 17 good passes in a row. Suddenly you hit snake eyes and it's all lost. There are games of wild betting. Jorge Luis Borges, the great storyteller, he has a story called The Library of Babel. For those who've read it, you know that there's this, in the library, there's this infinity of enigmatic books where you can spend years wandering its corridors or even lifetimes lost searching its hallways for the single answer behind the library or the universe. And some go mad, some form cults, some devise highly intricate numerologies and interpretive schemas. But my favorite is that some submit to the futility of all programmatic approaches and they just start deciding where to look based on dice throws. So they sit in corners and allow the dice to determine whether to turn right or left, high or low. And that's a movement into intentional randomness. That's another form of game. In fact, I remember years ago, I used to train for several years with a great Spanish sword master. And he always said, he had this one saying where he would always say that the most dangerous opponent for a master like him was a total amateur. Because someone with minor training will follow the lessons accordingly and easily be undone by the master's superior technique. But there is always some unpredictable risk in the know-nothing, you know, the novice who resorts to wild swinging through the air. Next category, I think it's there, is games of superstition. Superstition, interestingly, is ritualized wildness. So superstition admits to no belief in law, unity, or reason. It embraces the underlying notion of chaos. But it nevertheless qualifies, and this is really kind of a cool notion, it qualifies that certain methods or choreographies can somehow harness arbitrariness better. So it's learning how to play to the anarchy of things. And it's a strange paradox, but it actually is accurate. You can ask any professional gambler and they can tell you, you can actually refine your relation to luck. And that's not in the origins, but in the effects by practicing intuition, practicing reaction time, studying trajectivities of ricochet, and also engaging in hypothetical thought. Next category is games of narrow victory, landslide victory versus Pyrrhic victory. And those are based on different protocols and types of satisfaction, and also different definitions of the concept of excess. You got games of changing levels or roles. That's where hierarchies, positions, and identities are continually shifted throughout the game, and it restores players always to a 0 degree of transformation. So that's something like musical chairs or costume parties, or the tea party in Alice in Wonderland, where she's always switching seats, or those card games where there are rotating kings. And Borges again has a story, interestingly, called The Lottery in Babylon, where identity is renewed each night, and people draw lots, and swap titles and destinies every night. And at any given moment, you can become the slave, the apprentice, warrior, dancer, god of the city. Next category is that there are games of distraction. So those are games of temporary escapism. And that's like the masquerade or the rave, where it always guarantees return or homecoming. You're not going to stay there. Versus games of concentration. And those are very interesting. Those are rare games that demand all-consuming immersion. And those are games that become the world or take forever, where obsession drowns out the player's loyalty to their past, and they enter states of oblivion and radical forgetting. Hermann Hesse's glass bead game is an example of this. Games of clues and signs, that's where just the purpose is to detect hidden tells, read imperceptible patterns, the puzzle, the riddle, the scavenger hunt. That's where the player's always deciphering. You've got games with dealers. And again, when we're thinking about insurrection or extinction, I want to complicate sort of those concepts by just asking which of these are relevant, which of these we can kind of extend fantastically into those other concepts. Games with dealers like the tarot card reader or the blackjack dealer. Dealers are always supposedly a mechanistic intermediary. They embody the neutral, but you notice that the dealer is always blamed for the cards. And actually, the resentment of the player towards the dealer is indeed a correct intuition, because they do serve the house, and the house must win. Now, their evil collaboration between the dealer and the house is dulled by the more metallic look of probability, but nevertheless, it is a collusion that's taking place there. You've got games of territoriality. Everybody knows that that's where one side chooses the field or the battlefield, and that gives you an experiential advantage, but it also gives you a psychological advantage, and that's important in game playing. You've got games of infinity. That's endless lives, where you can constantly reset, versus games of finitude, which are all or nothing or one-shot deals. And a game that actually combines these concepts rather seamlessly is that of the ancient Chinese game of Go. And in fact, an intriguing piece of trivia that I learned from a Chinese student of mine is that the Japanese leagues of Go are reputed to have a special room called Yugen no Ma. And Yugen in Japanese is a word with connotations that mean shadow, subtlety, obscure elegance, and is more directly defined as mysterious depth or mystery at the light of day. So it's a gorgeous word. And this room is, for the Go masters, it's where only the highest level masters are allowed entrance. And they're rumored to channel the spirits and support of ancestral masters therein, which is a great idea. Getting to the end here, games of addiction, that's where the game increasingly becomes an obligation, a need, a neurotic compulsion. This occurs when the ludic figure, so the figure of spontaneous play, declines from techne to technics, if we want to get technical philosophically, which Heidegger, if you remember, defines technics as what refuses to let the earth be an earth. It's a cool line from him. So it's also distinguished more tangibly by the decline of pleasure into mere release from pain. So when we discuss extinction later, we can speculate whether existence itself, and particularly its will to perpetuation, is the first game to fall sway to this addictive degeneration. And then is the fantasy or speculation of extinction that we're talking about today, is it a cure to this first drug game? That the first drug game was our need to keep living in the first place. Last two, games of style. That's just where each player is expected to develop a singular performativity, something distinctive in the way they carry themselves, and where victory actually depends itself on originality, craft, rarity. That's where players have to become inimitable or iconic to prevail. And the last one is games of entering the opponent's mind, which is a state of hyper anticipation. And the first question you have to ask there when you try that, when you attempt that, is the opponent tactical or whimsical? And here we should definitely consult with those early pagan thinkers from thousands of years ago, because they contemplated dealing both with scheming gods, so those were gods who operated from plans, and temperamental gods, which were volatile or impulsive ones. And the reason for that is because it teaches us the first step to any game is to correctly identify the game master as either a diabolical architect or unreliable force. And the reason for that is that then changes your tactical mindset as to whether you should be reading steps or reading moods. So I can end there for now.
Thank you, Jason. That was a wonderful run through of tactics that could be expanded on this subject. I don't know what Thomas might have to say about this rundown. Please go ahead.
Yeah, there was a lot there. That's a brilliant bestiary of games. Yeah, and I'm sure we'll come through all of the various themes you touched on through the rest of the discussion. But yeah, just off the top of my head, taking some notes here of stuff that I was finding interesting as you were talking. Near the beginning, when you said, there are these two camps of the kind of the dwelling, the world against us, and the world as indifferent. So, I think I'm clearly in one of those camps. I'm very much of the world as indifferent camp. The kind of grand theme of modernity, as I see it, is the dismantling of teleological worldviews, and these worldviews don't have to be ones that believe that the world is imbued with value. So that's the theodical Leibnizian optimism. They can also be the pessimistic types that think that the world is maximally disvaluable. So one of the interesting things, and this is me thinking about extinction, is historically, I mean, for to really kind of condense this down into a really basic narrative, the discovery of extinction as a major topic of human thought arises from the discovery that humans wouldn't necessarily return, or our values wouldn't necessarily return, if we were to go extinct. So people, after the Copernican turn, presumed that all the other planets were populated. That was just simply the default assumption, because the assumption behind that was that the universe itself is maximally full of values. And so that led to this idea that, if we die here, there'll be humans elsewhere to continue the project. There'll be other valuable moral agents. Or if we die here, something else will re-evolve. Myriad people said this explicitly. And that means that you're kind of trivializing all the stakes involved in existence, right? So, you're losing the idea of there being some kind of importance, because no matter what we do, something else will appear elsewhere. So there's actually a similar idea appears in Nick Bostrom's work. He talks about something called infinitarian paralysis, which is this idea that if the cosmos is genuinely infinite in some sense, all possibilities will be realized, and they'll be realized infinite times. So, why save the dodo here when I know that there are infinitely many other planets populated with dodos? Obviously, the same goes for our species. So this is a kind of return to this, pre-Enlightenment worldview, which was just returning humanoids across all planets. Okay. Now, I see the problem in this idea of a trivialization of stakes. As soon as people start to become disenchanted with nature, you get this other option, which is an inverted theodicy, which basically says that the world is maximally full of disvalue, in the sense of it being malign in some sense. So that's why I drew it to teleology at the beginning, is this idea that the world is in any sense designed with an intention to be some certain way that involves a moral judgment. That's a teleological kind of thinking. So you get this sense with people like Sartre and Schopenhauer first, and it continues through into various modern thinkers, that the world is in some way maximally malign. And there's a nice tradition of these people as well saying that, so Sartre actually says it. Sartre says it most explicitly. He says, that it's the principle of nature to maximize destruction and cruelty. So if humanity were to go extinct here and now, that would just be replenishing nature, her energies, so that she could create another species to torture and be cruel to. So again, it's the same trivialization of the stakes. It's just one that can parade as, slightly disillusioned and hard-nosed, because it comes, with this sense of disillusionment with, these kind of elder, more optimistic worldviews. So yeah, I would say, I'm very much the world is indifferent. But but I really do like this heuristic of thinking about, thinking about there being a game that we're playing somehow. Now, of course, maybe that assumption of naturalism and the assumption of naturalism regarding reality, and then also some kind of idea of self-election regarding value that's going on in the background of what I just said, that could be bracketed if you then talk about things about the fact that you could go down the simulation argument route. But let's not go into that here. But I really like this idea of there being a game that we're potentially playing. So and to talk on the cosmic gamble idea, another one of the grand themes of modernity and science, since for the past 300-400 years is the discovery of the stringency of the conditions required for life, and on top of that, intelligence. So we now realize that for what we know, the observable universe seems to be completely sterile, barren, devoid of large scale expressions of what we'd see, what we'd think of as intelligent values. So there's this idea, of course, if there had been kind of Kardashev 3 civilizations, these very powerful forms of intelligence, we'd see galaxies in the form of platonic solids and stuff like that, but we don't. So that implies that life, and more so intelligent life, is incredibly rare. So this idea of a cosmic gamble is really powerful. So I think one of the best people to express it was Stanislav Lem. He said that we are the result of the blind statistical fury of the stars. And then he actually uses the image of a roulette table and says that galaxies are these swirling roulette games, and thus we are the product of hecatombs and holocausts. Those are his words. So I really like that. And in terms of just as a kind of final point, just looking through the list of games that this kind of brilliant list of games that we were just presented with, I would go for games of style as the way that I most comfortably like to conceptualize what we're doing with a human project, or what we're doing as an intelligent species. And that's because of this idea of what I was saying of the collapse of teleological worldviews, which is itself tantamount to the idea that what we find valuable is self-elected in some sense. So it's not valuable because it's narrowly reflected back to us by the natural world. It's valuable because in some sense we've self-elected it to be so. We've bound ourselves by certain rules. This applies to beauty just as much as to what we'd normally consider more straightforwardly moral values. Is nature is often very beautiful, but only by accident. That idea of system is very much the exception, not the rule, given that we now know that the universe appears to be mostly inorganic. So I think a game of style is what we're playing. Is there's something significant about us. Now, I don't use the word rarity, and I know that you define the game of style as in that sense of rarity, because the way I like to think about it is this cosmic gamble that we're playing. We aren't valuable just because we're rare. It's more the sense that we now acknowledge that the external cosmos is completely unresponsive to what we consider valuable. So it's more the sense that we have obligations to ourselves. So no matter the amount of the prevalence or non-prevalence of other intelligent life forms elsewhere, there are certain obligations that we have to observe. So I like to think of it like this: is kind of act how it'd be coherent with the continued existence of intelligent life in the cosmos, and that kind of sense of nonchalance that comes from thinking that the universe is maximally full of value or maximally full of disvalue, no matter if you want to be an optimist or a pessimist. That form of nonchalance contradicts that imperative. So I like to think we're playing a game of style here. And as one last thing, is Freeman Dyson, who this brilliant physicist, the Dyson sphere guy. he had this really great thing where he said, you know, this cosmos that we live in is, you know, it's not maximally any one way or another in terms of value judgments. It's completely unresponsive to those things. It's not as good as possible. It's not as evil as possible. It's not malign. It's not designed. He said, whatever fate we want it to be, it's our fate to make it so. So, you know, I think that's the game we're playing. Another thing is, David Pearce, this transhumanist philosophy, said, you know, our ethicists don't tend to talk to physicists and vice versa, but the entire structure of our light cone might hang upon what our values are. So yeah, game of style.
Absolutely. No, I would agree with that. That's my favorite as well. I would say that you're absolutely right. I don't think that it's essential for there to be a teleological sensibility or an intending conscious overseer for us to perceive some of the parameters of existence as game-like. You know, there's a tangible facticity to the inhospitality of the desert. You know, that it's not a hospitable environment. You know, people from my neck of the woods, from my part of the world, sort of, they know that. You go back to ancient Arabian poetry and you see that the way they survive the desert, where there's shortages of water, of food, of all kinds of scorching heat, is by adapting and using ingenuity to devise all kinds of novel forms of apparel, from the, you know, the veil and the scarves and things like that, to vessels, how to use caravan, what times of the night you should travel in, how long you should stay at certain places, even down to very grotesque techniques of if you're caught in the desert in sort of frozen temperatures, you should crawl into the stomach of your camel. You should slaughter your own camel. And there are a lot of Arabian poetry, pre-Islamic, about that, about nomadic Bedouins sort of who had to exist that way. And so, you know, we can still perceive cyclicality, sort of schematics, patterns, sort of without there necessarily being a metaphysics above it. You know, the jungle has certain rules. You know, when you read South American writers like Horacio Quiroga, and he talks about the snakes and all of that, how to dodge snakes and everything. And the desert has rules. The forest has rules. Kafka teaches us that. You know, and Kafka even writes like the forest, with a kind of quicksand element to it. If you look at Bachelard, you know, his psychoanalysis of fire, you know, he perceives that as sort of learning a game without necessarily there being a god of fire who designed, you know, sort of the premise. So it can be accidental, can be random, can have all these elements of contingency, which I'm good with. It's just the question is at the level of effect, not the level of truth, whether it's a better story for us to think, you know, in order to kill time while time is killing us, to think like Artaud, that the entire universe is chasing us, you know, sort of at some levels. It, at the very least, you know, schizophrenia is ecstatic in this way. It avoids the bad psychology of alienation and despair, you know, and so there's nothing wasted, there's nothing irrelevant in the schizophrenic's universe or the manic universe, because everything is part of a conspiratorial alignment. And so, you know, for those short breaths that we take, it's cool to think yourself in a game rather than abandoned to the dark, even if that's more true, you know, at some level. But cool, that was fun. Federico, what you got next for us?
Oh, I think Thomas was going to say something first.
Yeah, just one quick thing. It's kind of like a slightly darker version of like the Persian long view, is that, you know, there's the kind of the game that reality is beneath the surface, you know. Yeah, and I think that's, yeah, it's a useful, if we want to be completely pragmatic and, you know, even pragmatist, I guess it's yeah, it's at least it's kind of like a regulative ideal, right? As you know, it's what motivates us to want to know what this larger structure that we're playing in is. Yeah, so yeah, I like that way of thinking about things.
And Thomas and Jason, since I think we can like diverge from the initial schema that we have, because I think this is very rich. And I was thinking about what Jason said at the start before he got into his listing of games and strategies, about how, and I think this can relate to both of your theorizing about the subject, that to which or to who are we playing this game? Like there's some specific rules that one has to abide to in order to choose between, let's say, if we go once again to the more simplified options of extinction and insurrection, this plays into fact on how we develop this rule abiding, this going by the rules. So I would like to ask, how also there's this difference between what Jason also said about adaptation for, let's say, what we're faced upon by these externalities that put the rules of the games, how we adapt to those rules, and how we also can change them. This also has to do with what both of you were saying about style, I think. So how, well, and this also, I wanted to bring this up. I was thinking about addiction and extinction as this being carried away by the desire of the thanatos, of death, of the pulsional desire of self-annihilation, and how that is also addictive. And this can be seen also in Thomas's recent essay on cosmic Setianism and cosmic fictionism that was published recently. And I see, let's say, how it's easy to give in. Like it's also a very easy choice. There's a certain factor of addiction. So I would like to ask about that, how we can go further down the paths of addiction, adaptation, how that comes into play with how Jason was talking about to whom we are playing the game, to how we need to acknowledge that there's a certain path to be taken, regarding rules, and how we can flexibilize that, or we'll become addicted. How does addiction play with that? Losing the stride of the game. I don't know what you think about that.
I could give a quick, sort of a quick rundown too here, that, in your original provocation to us, your prompt, you use the word catastrophe as well. And it's an excellent thing, because even by breathing the word catastrophe, you've just transported us into a different typology of malevolent games. And those are games that threaten us by being based on a single concept, which is the ultimatum. And you actually gave both of us, as kind of our game master here today, an ultimatum: insurrection or extinction. And so that even that initial question of the either or assumes a significant breach in the continuum of things. I think there's room to think there whether that breaking point you're talking about represents a threshold, which would mean a transitional space, a portal, a precipice, which would mean a cliff's edge into certain death, or a crossroads, which is a forked path that requires us to make a decision. But either way, all three entail, they all have their own methodology and implication, but in every instance of catastrophic imagination, it always places us in the experiential domain of loss. And I think it might be worth thinking about categories of games where one's bound to lose or even wants to lose. And I think addiction actually plays into that as well. And so, I've said elsewhere, there's first type of loss that I always like to think about is affective loss. And that's the idea of where being caught is the greatest thrill. So actually the intensity is highest for the one who fails the game. So that's hide and seek, that's tag, that's Russian roulette, even at a more fatal level. And that's where all the exhilaration is compressed into the breakdown. So the loser gets the highest affective reward, right, for that. That's the being caught. There's also the close call. And that's, gamblers will tell you this, but I also used to talk with figures. I talk with strange people sometimes. So I've talked to archers, and I've talked to Afghani mind diffusers. And the thing that binds them together is that these are people who are figures of immense precision and accuracy: the race car driver, the archer, the mind diffuser. And the more one attains mastery or even approaches perfection, they all say that the more you you develop a sinister curiosity to deviate or miss the mark. So you keep tempting yourself closer and closer to fatal error. You drive nearer to the wall, or you make the conditions harder by shooting with a blindfold, or you make the chances of survival or victory more unlikely. The Afghani mind diffuser told me the story that after his 5,000th try, he started caressing involuntarily the wrong wire and just wondering, what would it be like if my scissors clipped the wrong one? And he said, that's when you got to get out of the game. You got to get out of the profession, because your mind is starting on a slippery slope. So all of this, and it makes sense to me, it's totally logical, because it embodies the final stage of exaltation. The criterion of becoming a god or apotheosis is not only to create and dominate a world, but also to be able to destroy it. And so these people who gamble with perfection, that is the mark of perfection at some levels. But then there's also strategic loss, if I could just say quick. That's affective loss, where all sort of the affect is there. But then there's strategic loss, artistic death, for instance. We remember that Socrates and others pronounced that philosophy is an ars moriendi, an art of dying. And even Camus says the only philosophical question worth asking is whether to kill oneself. Calois, Roger Calois, great figure of the 20th century, who wrote on games, says that a game has to be voluntary. But we also know from the existentialists that we're supposedly thrown into this existence, which then means by definition, we're not in a game, unless there's actually a way to make it voluntary. And this is how the dream of extinction gives us the absurd freedom to wrench existence into the voluntary, not in its origin, but in its closure, that we have the power to stop playing the game. I also think if you go back to the ancient definition of glory, if you look at heroic archetypes, glory was always defined as dying or losing in spectacular form. That's why in Greek mythology, it suggested that the heroes who studied with this centaur Chiron, Hercules studied with him, Achilles studied with him, he had this human torso and horse's hind legs, and he taught them archery, gymnastics, musical instruments. Who knows why that's helpful in battle, but it is. And he ends up trading his own immortal life for the freedom of Prometheus. It's a great myth. But at any rate, he warns all his students, Chiron the centaur warns all his students, that in order to become the greatest warriors on the face of the earth, they have to die early. That is the price, is that they die young in order to attain immortality. That's also, interestingly, the paradox of monstrosity. The vampire, the ghost, the zombie, or the mummy are those who often die in the most brutal ways in order to achieve supernatural status as the undying. So that's that. You got bribery. That's where one loses or takes a fall for reasons of other compensation because they're paid off. You've got eternity, and this is an important one for me. There's an ecstatic dimension to this equation of losing as well, and one that makes us ask, what's the relationship between fatality and eternity? Nietzsche, at the conclusion of Zarathustra, talks about, quote, the drunken joy of dying at midnight. At the same time that he says, and this is a great paradox, and he says, and was this life one more time then? So that means he wants it to keep going and he wants it to stop. And he defines ecstasy as that bizarre outer boundary where one simultaneously says, this is another quote from Nietzsche I love, and how could I bear to go on living, and how could I bear to die now? And this makes acute sense if you're willing to abandon rigid logic and instead you take a deranged walk with storytellers. For example, Scheherazade from 1001 Nights, in order to survive and stave off her own execution at dawn by a mad king, each night she recounts these cliffhanger tales of intrigue and cruelty that continually extend the duration of the end forever. On a darker note, Émile Cioran, some of you guys may know him, said that the thought of suicide got him through a lot of bad nights and in fact saved him. The exact quote by Cioran is something like, without the idea of suicide, I would have killed myself a long time ago. And in my own work on omnicide, I correspond with these principles because the trick is that the explicit engagement with doomsday visions buys us time before the absolutism of the last breath. The trick is to try and extend the last note, the last breath, as long as possible. End of the world poets or philosophers of the lost cause, whatever you want to call us, it's about developing a magic touch where you can make the last moment everlasting. That's one of the concepts there. So the idea of eternity there being precisely linked with annihilation. Bataille, your friend Federico, was also very intimately engaged with that. Nihilism. Thomas has a lot better things to say than me about this probably, but those who lose to clear possibility, sort of who are in a state of exhaustion, who have only a vague horizon or no horizon at all. Benjamin, at the end of his life, wrote a short piece called The Destructive Character, which is a really ominous and enigmatic piece in which he talks about purging and flooding the world in a kind of anything but this modality. He doesn't know exactly. He doesn't have a utopian sensibility or an aftermath in mind. It's just about a reckoning that would open the terrain of possibility. Martyrs, on the other hand, that's another form of strategic loss. Those are people who lose because they want someone else specific to win. The worst or best example of this, the most glaring example of this, Federico has read this with me. One of my favorite writers, Sadegh Hedayat, spent 12 years obsessively writing a masterpiece called The Blind Owl, only to commit suicide afterwards because he said, I wanted to pave the way for him to emerge, for it to emerge rather, this character. So he was unnecessary. Martyrs also sacrifice themselves consciously as a payment or trade for another's triumph. And we can even think more interestingly about those servile characters in films who betray the human race to aid the rise of the inhuman. So that's like that figure who, the apprentice to the alien or the vampire or the machine. Getting to the end of this, conspiracy. Those are people who lose intentionally in order for the alliance to win. So I studied this for a while. I used to play at different card games a lot, and there are professional gamblers who often will team up, and they'll enter a casino and they'll gang up on these amateurs who come from out of town, not knowing that 3 of the people at the table of 5 are actually working together. They're throwing signals to one another, they're throwing hands to one another, and working on the probability that the 3 will be able to dominate and drain the pockets of the other 2 by just sort of aligning themselves. So that's one form of conspiracy. But another one, actually the best I've ever seen, is when traveling through Eastern Europe, child gangs. They bait themselves, they use themselves as bait. So a single child will lure sort of the passerby in a way that brings them into the grip of a waiting pack. So they use multiplicity and conspiratorially that way. You got the long game. That's the idea of those who specifically lose in the short term in order to win in the long run. Marx actually, I don't often quote Marx, but Marx has a dangerous logic that the final successful revolution will redeem all prior struggles. Man, that is a hell of a statement, because that justifies casualties and blood ad infinitum. At the level of the radical individual, where I'm more comfortable, outcasts, rogues, deviant, you can look at people who were losers in their time, Nietzsche, Kafka, who risk untimeliness or alienation to later send shivers down the spine of history. And kind of engrave their names. There's no reason on earth why you should think that Nietzsche and Kafka, who are poor, who are marginalized, who are unpublished in their own time periods, will engrave themselves into the game board of this existence eventually, except they know it. And Deleuze and Guattari call this rare form of will the unstoppable. And even Artaud says beautifully, quote, "They laugh at us now and live off us later." So there's something to playing the game that way that ensures that. And the last thing I'll just give it as an example of strategic loss is disguised loss. And those are people who appear as losers in order to reverse situations or wield the element of surprise. So there are stories of prophets, assassins, or martial artists who wear robes of the beggar or who act physically crippled in order to appear vulnerable and seize control of the game. So I would say all of these sort of are forms of strategic loss, that if we are bound for extinction, that doesn't mean that it's game over necessarily in the same way. I'll end there.
Wonderful, Jason. So I would like to pass on the mic to Thomas.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, there's loads to say about addiction. Hopefully I'll come to that later, but I just want to respond to some of the stuff that you raised there. So yeah, the idea of I find, yeah, the idea of the kind of betraying the human in some sense to kind of allow the monstrous. I think that this is an idea that you do see a fair amount of times. So that, like, the kind of post-humanist, and I'm not saying that you were kind of going down this line, but the post-humanist kind of leitmotif of beyond the human. So you have vitality beyond the human, kinship beyond the human, creativity beyond the human, etc., etc. Yeah, I mean, again, I think of those as like a kind of return to again, like, yeah, let's keep using the word teleology. I see it as this idea, you're reifying basically like moral values as part of the independent universe that would continue without us. So yes, of course, in some way, creativity would, but again, this idea that nature is inherently creative is one that is a problematic concept, because like I was saying with beauty earlier, independent nature often is creative, but only through the hecatombs and holocausts, which any kind of morally conscious being would hopefully find somewhat abhorrent once you actually think about them. And that connects into what you said about Marx, is that telic point I agree that, and it's actually self-evident that that kind of thinking can lead to the horrendous justifications. But it depends on the way you're framing it. So I think that final revolution, there's an idea related in the kind of X-risk discourse. People talk about an existential catastrophe. So where an existential catastrophe is a massive, denudation of the moral value in the universe, which doesn't just have to be human extinction. It could be there are these ideas of suffering risks. So that would be actually one where humanity remains, but is in vast amounts of suffering indefinitely. So the opposite of that is the idea of an existential catastrophe, where you get this sudden uptick in the value, and no matter how you measure that, you don't have to measure that just in terms of hedonic pleasure. You can measure that in terms of beauty. You can measure it in terms of creativity, interestingness, whatever. But these are cognitive conscious values that need conscious, self-conscious agents to be around for them to have a foothold within the physical universe. So anyway, existential catastrophe, a sudden, uptick in, kind of on an astronomical scale, an uptick in value. Now, I don't think that would justify an event like that. Would justify all previous revolutions, all previous bloodshed, but it could atone for it in the sense that, as intelligent agents, we are the only thing in the local universe that could actually stop suffering, not just for ourselves, but for sentient beings within our biosphere and potentially within other biospheres. So I think, I don't know. I like that Marxian idea, and I don't think it necessarily has to be a justification of past bloodshed. It can be an atonement for it. It can give sanction to the fact that give sanction to the hecatombs and holocausts that birthed us. And that doesn't just have to be measured in terms of suffering. It can also be measured in terms of waste. There's a huge, going back to this motif of the sterility of the universe, that, by any rational standards, and this is again why we don't live in a teleological designed universe, by any rational standards, the fact that perhaps only one planet in however large number you want to come up with can harbor life, that's a massive waste of space. That sterility is an affront to any rational being. And so, this idea of atonement for the past that created us would also actually entail reversing, correcting that horrific sterility. So yeah, this is the idea that I'm fond of kind of like gardening the galaxy, of extending not just the scope of moral agency, because we happen to be moral beings, but also extending the scope of the biological foothold in the universe. I think that would be in and of itself a good thing. So yeah, I'm interested in thinking about those things. Another thing that I wanted to touch on was yes, this idea of the freedom that comes from omnicide. So Milton has a good quote. We are sufficient to have stood, though free to fall, and those things are in some sense intertwined. And I always like to say, since that's said in Paradise Lost in a very God-fearing way, it's to do with the fall and original sin, but it has only become more true since we ourselves have developed godlike powers. This is a cliche of futurist discourse, of basically just pop science since the 1960s, is that we are in some sense gods, but we are lack the wisdom. So it's a cliche, but I like it as a cliche. Gunther Anders, who was Hannah Arendt's first husband, I think, he had a really great idea. So he was interested in this idea from philosophical anthropology that this kind of flattering idea of human freedom is basically actually just a deprivation of instinct in the human animal. So it's a kind of slightly more naturalistic or naturalistic friendly explanation of the very flattering, rosy Enlightenment idea of the freedom of the human. and so throughout throughout this kind of this strain of philosophical anthropology, which goes from Herder down through to Paul Augsburg and these figures, there's an idea of this being slightly precarious as a breakthrough in the natural order. Is the human is in some sense responsible for its own means of survival. It doesn't rely on hardwired instinct. It relies on artifice and artificialization. But with that comes precarity. And so Gunther Anders took this to the next level, and he had this ongoing theme of the pathology of freedom, and he saw that as encapsulated in weapons of mass destruction, was that we kind of have gained these massive Promethean powers that can also be our undoing. I don't like I said, I'm kind of wary of romanticizing those kind of ideas, but like risk escalation is very much internal to the process of our learning more about ourselves and the world. And another cliche that's related to this, and again a cliche that I enjoy and like, is is a cliche of kind of post 1960s futurology, is this idea that it's the deepest past that jeopardizes our furthest future. So it's our instincts, our kind of wayward inherited behaviors of yesteryear that are now just being kind of merely fermented and volatilized by the expansion of our technology. So you originally get the Enlightenment vision of the expanse of human technology, which often had this very paradisical idea that we'd eventually turn the whole world into countryside and terraform the whole planet, so it'd look a little bit like comfortable, lovely Central Europe. Obviously that's not how it happened. The expansion of our powers also expanded the ability for us to screw things up. Climate change, the most obvious example. But yeah, just to kind of wrap this all back into the addiction idea, you'd be surprised how much the idea of addiction historically, percolates through the history of people thinking about extinction. It's the idea of so contemporaneously, I've been doing a bit of work on this recently. Is this idea called wireheading, and it emerges from neuroscience of the 1950s, of the discovery of the pleasure center in the brain of rats. So there were experiments in the 1950s. They put electrodes in the hypothalamus of a rat's brain, and the rat would be able to stimulate its own pleasure center by pressing a lever. Famously, the rats supposedly would press the lever monotonously and would forego drinking, reproduction, and food to the point of death. So that's a bit of a myth. Some rats did die, but in very artificial conditions. So this idea of the deadly addiction is a bit of a myth, but it leaked into popular culture, and it's become this idea ever since, is that somehow we may delight ourselves to death. And already back in the 60s, people were talking about the fact that with other animals, animals that don't tend to manipulate their environment at large scales, you have to kind of to elicit this kind of deadly pleasure-seeking behavior, you have to actually intervene in them artificially, so actually put an electrode in their brain. But people were already noticing back then that we are uniquely an animal that edits it, alters its environment at large scales in order to consummate its desires. So obviously where this is leading is the fear of the kind of hyper addictions of the fully enlightened earth. So skyrocketing obesity, plummeting fertility, because our energies are being routed elsewhere in terms of pornography. All of these kind of ideas, there's all this swirling apocalyptic discourse around them. It's this same idea that that enlightenment idea that technology will just very simply apply to the world and make it better, after, not just the disenchantment of nature, but the disillusionment of reason with itself, you get, and with that, the emergence of behavioral psychology, evolutionary psychology, and fields like that. With that, you get this, complexification of that narrative that, our ramifying ability to, artificialize, often actually just empowers our most ancient and wayward desires. So yeah, just as, one final kind of, way of wrapping this all up, to connect that back into this, this idea of somehow atoning for the past, I think, yeah, a nice way of reformulating that, age-old didactic futurist cliche of, the deepest past jeopardizing our furthest future. I think that it's our job to outpace those errors of our inherited past by, correcting and editing ourselves so as to achieve that future. So, that's, yeah, I think at least historically, addiction has been a surprisingly recurrent theme when it comes to thinking about extinction.
This is why I like Federico's question or his use of the term insurrection rather than revolution. And the reason for that is that, revolution can become addictive as a principle for anybody who has self-righteous revolutionary friends, and sort of their tonality, which compresses and condenses complex existences into one-dimensional ideological sort of archetypes. The problem with the idea of the final revolution is that it's the culminative sort of singular revolution, rather than, I like the idea of a dumb luck revolution that just happens to happen in Zimbabwe or Portugal or somewhere, that off the map, off the grid, that happens to be the one that gets it right or pulls the trick, and so that's more interesting to me than the one that is envisioned or foreseen in a kind of utopian horizon. The other reason is that, we can solve this problem of kind of addictive concepts in that regard, or addictive game playing, by going back to what any good professional gambler would tell you, which is play multiple hands. And so insurrection often requires multiple incursions and retreats. It's a paradigm that combines asymmetrical warfare with criminal play. So you stage eruptive plots in scattered formations. It's not centralized, but disparate, fragmented, kind of kaleidoscopic. And the best part is it seizes upon the logic of exceptionalism in evil. For good to be good, it has to be always good, absolutely good. It has to win 10 out of 10 hands in order to maintain purity. But evil only needs to win one hand in order to contaminate the scene and damn everything around it. I think that extinction and insurrection can also be framed that way, that it could require only one trigger to come through in order to collapse or or buy more time for the totality of the world. That's the advantage of evil, in that regard. And it also can use insurrection extinction, if we take it in this sort of plane, can use indeterminacy to its advantage, which has always been the fatal flaw of revolutionary paradigms. They don't like chance in the same regard historically. And that takes me to an interesting thing when Thomas was saying quite in fascinating ways about all sorts of the animals and the rat sort of formations. There is something, and you're going to forgive me, people are going to be surprised here, but I'm going to quote something cool from psychoanalysis, which is often an arch enemy of mine, but they're absolute geniuses in their own right. An important subgenre in psychological literature is something called the orienting reflex. And it's something that decades ago, a Russian neuroscientist, Evgeny Sokolov, referred to. It's the idea of how we reconstruct our interpretive models very suddenly when something happens abruptly that should not have happened. So that's like you come home and you find a wolf in your bedroom, right? This is beyond the boundaries of your expected reality. And then subsequently, based on this orienting reflex idea, you have cognitive psychologists like Lawrence Barsalou. He took a step further to analyze events like people escaping a burning house. He also, interestingly, analyzed people trying to avoid being killed by a mob, which is particularly resonant these days. But at any rate, the idea of escaping a burning house, in opposition to the classical image that we have of stampeding crowds in a theater on fire, where everybody's being trampled beneath the feet of everyone else while they're fleeing towards the doors, he actually discovered, and a lot of the cognitive psychologists discovered, that individuals are often able to instantaneously negotiate new complex categories and hierarchies in the spur of the moment. So first, the burning house, you got to run. You might, and then you have to take things, whatever you can carry. So the first category you might devise is you might prioritize living things, the child, the pet. Then valuable things, jewelry, documents, sentimental or irreplaceable things, photographs, inherited objects, while also simultaneously calculating portability. So that's immovable objects versus lightweight objects, location, proximity to the center of the fire or distance from the fire, all sorts of these things in this sort of split second of the moment. So this tells us that we might actually possess a talent for immediacy and a kind of alternative provisional consciousness at the extreme limit of risk. And what I'd argue is, if you go back to the ancients, because Thomas summoned them, and he summoned the ancient world, who I like very much, often much more than our time. Something that always fascinated me is that almost all of the earliest civilizations, Babylonian, Sumerian, Persian, Egyptian, they simultaneously devised creation myths and apocalypse myths. And they were imagined alongside one another at the same exact time, which is an incredible closing of the circle at the very moment of its inception. And we have to ask ourselves, at least for me, what these ancients, who encountered mortality at every turn in the form of famine, night raids, tribal war, disease and natural disasters, infant mortality rates that were skyrocketing all over the place. What did they suspect intuitively about this human experiment with time, consciousness, destiny, whatever you want to call it? They seem to have the accelerated vision of the decadents, who saw skeletons everywhere among living bodies, and the idea that it's over already, it's as good as done. But I think it actually allows us to think about how the concept of inevitability fuses into our discussion of risk and games here as well. And the reason I bring that up is that while they may have had this overhanging sense of inevitability, what always captivated me about ancient cultures is idolatry. Reza Negarestani he's teaching a course on demonology right now. He likes to remind people that the ancient Sumerians had so many names for so many different demons that the priests couldn't even remember all of them. And this is a fascinating landscape and topography, which is obviously then not based on absolute or authentic belief. It's based on, so to Thomas's wonderful sort of point that, do we have to have this kind of teleological faith in the thing that's going to take over? You don't have to believe in a side in order to take a side. Meaning you don't have to actually believe that the side you choose in a game is the better side or the superior side just for you to take it. I had an old professor once who actually was the first one who exposed me to Nietzsche, who one day I walked in his room, he was like in his 80s at the time. He told me, unpack your backpack, show me what's in it. And I remember exactly what was in it. To my discredit, Heidegger's Being in Time, and to my credit, Bataille's Inner Experience. These two great books, sort of in the. And he said, and he looked at the table and he said, "Impossible." And I said, "What do you mean impossible?" He goes, "You cannot live your life with both of these things simultaneously in your backpack. You have to choose a side. If you put these two people in an elevator, they will kill one another." And he said, "Whose side are you on?" And I said, I looked, I was literally 19 at the time. And I said, "What are you asking me here? What is this weird ultimatum that you're giving me?" And he said, "No." He goes, "They're in an posited they're in a fight." He posited in a violent contest. He goes, "Whose back do you have?" And I said, "Well, what's my criterion for decide?" I'm still reading it. You don't have time to read them. You don't have time for the academic delusion of comprehensibility or legitimacy or analysis. You have to choose. Go on your whim. Go on your instinct. I said, Bataille. He said, "Game over. Throw Heidegger away. You don't need him anymore." Now, I'm not saying that's the method. I don't tell my students to do that either. But it was a cool moment for me. And it came back to haunt me, that great confrontational moment came back to haunt me when I looked at how ancient peoples chose their idols. You've got 72 idols to choose from in the temple. Why did you choose number 46? It's almost like a takeout menu. It's horizontal. There's no right or wrong answer. It's taste, it's whim, it's impulse, it's attraction, it's surface. It's not depth. It doesn't require belief. It requires performativity and attraction. It's a certain desiring machine, to use that term. I like that. So I think in games, we can take sides without believing in them. So if somebody turns to me and says, of all of the paranoiac myths of the 1980s sci-fi, of what will take over the world for the human race, whether it's cyborgs or clones or vampires or aliens or machines or Baudrillard's favorite, the image will inherit the destiny of the world, I say, cool, as long as you don't believe it, but you take a side and you want the images to take over, good for you. Play the game accordingly. You know, why not? So anyway, that's just my take on that.
No, I think it's fantastic. Thomas, I don't know if
Yeah,
you want to say
yeah.
something.
So on the point of having to choose between it was Heidegger and Bataille, right? Yeah. On the point of having to choose between them, I guess, yeah. I mean, that's like a hangover. Well, it's an artifact of scarcity, right? You know, everyone has a certain amount of time. You know, you can't read everyone, right? Say if we were able to have more time, and that's also something that could, you know, there's nothing, you know, there's no physical law that means that we wouldn't be able to have enough time in our lives to read both Heidegger and Bataille. So, you know, that idea of this, you know, this most of the ways that we think are brought about under scarcity, right? And, you know, we can remove a lot of those, not all of them, because to go back to this idea of the games of infinity, there is no game of infinity, at least not in this physical universe. You know, there is an absolute cap that this universe puts on the ability for us to do valuable things. Again, no matter how you define valuable, you know. But you know, that can lead down into the nihilist route. But I don't think it needs to. It's precisely the opposite conclusion. Is at least as legitimate and I think more coherent, is because time and therefore value is a scarce resource. It means that we have a finite amount of time to do interesting things in. So we should maximize and try and do as many interesting things as possible. And so I want to, in the chat, there's a comment, and I want to just try and tie these two things together. So it's from Carl Olson. He says, there seems to be an underlying question here concerning what a moral intelligence decides to make itself responsible for, especially in regard to the quote from Marx. For the revolution to be a redeeming or atoning event, has one not already made a set of substantial commitments regarding what time, spaces, and people one is responsible for? What might these be in a statement such as Marx's? So, you know, I don't want to speak for Marx, but you know, there are certain very unique responsibilities. So, you know, one of them is the responsibility for the very locus of responsibility, which, you know, that is this kind of existential scale of looking at things. It doesn't matter what you think is right and wrong in terms of responsibility. There is actually this kind of encompassing field. So, you know, there's this kind of responsibility, right? This is kind of what I was talking about earlier with this idea of, you know, acting so as to be coherent with, you know, the continuing intelligence of intelligence, you know, the continuing existence of intelligence in the universe, right? So, you know, it's a lot of these things are open questions, and they will remain so by definition. But, you know, this idea of there being, you know, this kind of, you know, higher level responsibility going on. So, you know, it's the imperative behind all imperatives is one way of thinking about it. Doesn't matter what you think the sub imperatives are, you know, the kind of hypothetical imperatives. There is this categorical imperative. I wouldn't say it's nicely defined in the, you know, the way that Kant defined it has its flaws. And, you know, this more categorical higher level one is, yeah, that we have a responsibility to the very locus of responsibility in the physical universe. Anyway, I'll stop meandering around that point. So the way of linking that into this, you know, into this scarcity thing is, I think another kind of these higher level responsibilities is the mere possibility of extinction or frustration preference, right? Is an affront to, you know, an affront to rationality. So therefore, you know, our very, you know, this game that we're playing, this game of existence, our job isn't over until we have done as much as possible to minimize those things in the world. So, to counter the forces of extinction, to counter the forces that create preference frustration, and similarly on the point of suffering. So I think those things kind of just come. A rational being cannot but be interested in those things. So basically, yeah, where that all leads is, what is this point where we've counted, the forces of extinction to the the maximal possible point? Because again, like I said, there's a cap on value in this universe. One point in the vast future, value will disappear. But again, in that kind of, nice cliche that death makes life meaningful, that's what makes value also meaningful. Anyway, so what is this point where we've counted the forces of extinction to the maximal possible point? Yeah, I think it's a point where, the only risks that we take are ludic. So, I think the very ability to kind of have an opinion, to have a belief, to be an intentional agent requires some degree of risk. You can kind of connect this into like inferentialism and the idea that, it's the kind of ability to be wrong or be corrected that allows you to, have even so much as have a belief about the world, right? So in a sense, that form of intentional consciousness requires a sense of the risk, not a physical risk to your being necessarily, the hazard of being wrong. So I think, yeah, once we've removed all those other risks, there'll still be that, the risk of play where we will be, hopefully playing paradisical games, and the stakes are interior to the game rather than, there being kind of, our lives being on the line all the time, which is the default for beings of the Darwinian order, which, we're halfway, well, we're on the way out, but we're still very, very much part of that order. So yeah, that's my kind of comment on the, the future of games, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas, for that answer. I think Jason wants to say something.
I would just say that, there is, Thomas is absolutely right about our finitude and about the limitations sort of that are imposed on us. I was mentioning the desert earlier. You can't breathe in outer space, but that doesn't mean that you can't devise an apparatus that lets you breathe in art. If we enter the domain of artificiality, in a philosophical sense, I adore Nietzsche's gesture of untimeliness for this reason. He basically sells out his own contemporaneity and his own era to say things like, only the day after tomorrow belongs to me. I'm born posthumously. He throws dice and projects a gamble into some unspoken, and the best part is every idiot and their brother thinks in the 20th century it's them he's talking about. So Heidegger thinks he's the legacy, Bataille thinks he's the Baudrillard loves Nietzsche the most, Kafka loves Nietzsche the most, Artaud loves Nietzsche the most. They all have a room in the Nietzschean hotel, and thinking that they're the true heirs. But he only gives rise to bastard heirs. He only gives rise to sort of hybrid offspring. You can't say that for any other philosopher that I know. Heideggerians all sound like a cult to me. Derridians sound like a cult to me. They chant the mantras of their masters. Freudian psychoanalysts, the same way. They just go in line. They memorize the terminology. They apply it in the most predictable, formulaic ways. How the hell on earth could Foucault, Deleuze, Baudrillard, Kafka, Artaud, Heidegger, Bataille all claim lineage to Nietzsche's throne? And only because he precisely gambled on the fact that his time, there's no one on earth, he said, who can read me now. It's a fascinating gesture of like throwing messages in bottles into the ocean and just, seeing sort of where they land on what strange shores. But to that, I wanted to say something to Thomas' point as well. In terms of our imperative to protect our time or to serve our time in a certain way, it's an interesting idea, but the problem becomes complicated when we see the 20th century's sort of cataclysmic effects, that often, if Federico has posited a kind of dialectic for us, insurrection versus extinction, look at the ways in which these concepts have folded into one another and produced their counterpart. So insurrection as a gateway to extinction. Look at the Stalinist gulags, where a revolutionary motif ends up in a genocidal sort of paranoiac will, or the Holodomor of the Ukrainian famine, where millions of people starved to death under the guise of insurrectionary beliefs. Or the more interesting to me than that, because we've seen that play out a million times, extinction as a form of insurrection. Now that's cool to me. Is there a rebellious potential in condemnation? Oedipus's defiant gesture of tearing out his own eyes, right, makes him, interesting thing, people always end at Oedipus Rex, the Oedipus the king, and then they're like, yeah, he tore out his eyes, the climax. They forget there's a trilogy. There's actually a second one, Oedipus at Colonus, where he's now like a beggar in rags, wandering nomadically from city to city. And the interesting thing is that that defiant gesture, that insurrection gesture of tearing out his own eyes, makes him the blesser and curser of cities in the aftermath. So he has an extinction touch, kind of, this almost supernatural ability to do that. Same as Cain. Cain is the first human born outside of the garden, supposedly. And why? Because his parents lost the game or failed the test, however you want to read it. He's also the first lawbreaker. But notice this wins him the touch of the accursed. Cain too can curse anything he wants. So there's power gained in that, sort of an extinction power gained from his insurrection. And interestingly, this is even the devil's bet against God in the classical monotheistic sense. It's a story where a failed rebellion, so that's our starting point, a failed rebellion is tied to an extinction outcome, in that the devil is, well, one, thrown out, he's exiled, but also that the devil becomes the agent of hell, which is definitionally the extinction of the soul. So, but notice it doesn't end there. He's still a gambler. The devil is still a gambler, caught forever in a computational race against the divine to steal as many hands, i.e. souls, and hoard as many humans like cards or game pieces until Judgment Day, when the game's winner is announced. So there's a certain kind of rebel. I like poets. There's certain Middle Eastern rebel poets who claim that they would only embark on wars where they were destined to lose. And it's an interesting notion. So I just want to sort of complicate this idea that sometimes we think we're entering the maze's door of extinction and it leads to an insurrection, and sometimes we think an insurrectionary modality is precisely becomes the curtain call of an extinction of certain kinds. And I would just say this, that there's a beautiful notion in Baudrillard's thinking, where he said it in one of his obscure last books that unfortunately nobody reads closely enough. You know, I think that's where a lot of his genius was being harbored, is at the end there in those aphorisms. But he says something in a book which is good for both Thomas's and our interests, our overlapping interests. He has a very short book called Why Hasn't Everything Already Disappeared? And in it, he makes the claim that the inception of a theoretical concept is always simultaneous to the obsolescence of that concept, meaning it only becomes enunciated as a theory once it's too late and it's no longer going to exist. So he says, give me a break. We've had revolutions for thousands of years, and Marx comes along and he's the first philosopher of revolution. He's not, but you know, you get, so he's credited with that. And he goes, maybe that's because it was signaling a threshold at which revolution will no longer be possible. Freud's unconscious. Every good sort of old woman of the village in Iran knows the unconscious intuitively. They've been playing at it. They gossip in certain ways. They understand unconscious. You don't need Freud to come along and theorize the unconscious unless the unconscious is becoming a historically and existentially obsolete category, because in the time of its enunciation. That also would go for Baudrillard's simulation himself. He's kind of writing a requiem to his own sort of philosophical inventiveness. And so I would just throw it out there that it's a really sort of intriguing notion that the very ability for us to consciously formulate the idea often means that it's on expiring time. We're in sort of the hourglass.
Yeah, I think I think that's that why hasn't everything already disappeared? I haven't heard of that. I'm gonna have to look into that. So thank you. Yeah, but yeah, this idea of kind of extinction and insurrection somehow being coupled. Yeah, again, so I would push back on the idea that, you know, that anything about extinction could be generative, because you know, it's the end of human consciousness. So you know, again, I'm not sure if you were saying this, but you know, obviously like playing fast and loose with kind of what extinction is in a sense. So like, you know, there's the level of extinction as an end of something, and then there's, you know, this kind of this kind of more I guess more, you know, more heavy, more thick concept of extinction being the end of kind of you know, human consciousness, I guess is a very simple way of putting it. So yeah, you know, the example of, you know, the Bible and Satan, you know, that's not an extinction at all. That's just like a kind of an irreversible threshold that has some loss involved for, you know, from Satan's perspective, I guess. So yeah, I think there's like a temporal kind of spatiotemporal parochialism in a lot of our moral intuitions. Basically, that is to say, you know, our moral intuitions don't scale very well. So, you know, the idea that somehow like catastrophic life events are generative, I think that there's clearly a reason behind the fact that we all kind of feel that as intuitive. You know, again, Nietzsche put it best, you know, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, right? Yeah, you know, one of the kind of worst Nietzsche quotes, but, you know, still, it encapsulates a good idea, right? You know, so yeah, I think in our daily experiences, we make mistakes, and it's useful for us to think of those as generative in some sense. But the extinction of all humanity just absolutely would not be generative. It would not be an insurrection. It would be the end of all possible insurrections. You know, unless you think of, you know, again, you're going to have to make it into that kind of story. You're going to have to kind of go down the route of there being returning humanoids on this planet or elsewhere. You know, is that, you know, so there is this idea out there that biodiversity would kind of bounce back up without humans. Again, there's no actual particular reason for that to be the case. You know, this idea of Gaia being inherently self-balancing, you know, there's also the other hypothesis, the Medea hypothesis, that, you know, the biosphere kind of tries to eradicate things every now and again. You know, it might well be the case that our biosphere is very self-sustaining and has all these homeostatic feedback loops, but that doesn't mean that it was designed to be that way. So again, to go back to this teleology theme, you know, and I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but you know, just because it happens to be homeostatic now, that's actually finite as well. So, you know, the biosphere will degrade, those feedback loops will degrade in about 1 billion years. So, you know, this idea of there being some kind of creativity beyond the human, this idea that extinction could be an insurrection, you know, in the sense of being some kind of, you know, vitalistic event, you know, that, yeah, I mean, that's nonsense, and you can only really see it. You weren't saying this at all, Jason, but, you know, you can only really see that as not a genocidal tragedy unless you are, in some sense, like an animist or a panpsychist. You know, and yeah, then we can argue about that. But I think at least you'd have to at least kind of admit that you think there is values in the world beyond there being agents around to understand them and elect them as valuable. You know. And yeah, then you are falling back into a teleological worldview. So yeah, sorry, that's just me berating on other strands of thought. But yeah, this idea of the coupling between extinction and insurrection, which is what you were talking about. Yeah, you know, I kind of am wary of that because I feel that it can collapse into that type of thinking. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, well, first, I mean, we define our terms. You know, is extinction always necessarily defined as the absolute or the all-encompassing? Can there be minor extinctions? There are extinctions of species that are not the extinction of the universe, right? You know, and in sort of in the cosmic totality of the sense. And it's not always, extinction is not always a human sort of enterprise also, right? There are whole debates that can be raged about. Every good or bad apocalypse movie usually shows the extinction of the human race, but the billboards are still standing and the televisions are still playing and the radios are still on. Just as the fact that we're being recorded right now, we're going to be sent into some digital archive that, you know, you and I can die tomorrow, we can perish from the earth, but they can play us on a loop of infinite reproducibility. And so the echo is, whether the echo has value or whether the reproduction has value or not, in the sense that you're defining value, and whether that's a kind of a terrible gamble in and of itself to sort of give the legacy of existence over to the ghostly or the phantasmatic sort of realm of images. That's a good point, for sure. But I'm thinking at the most sort of microcosmic level of even something like vendetta, the idea of a vendetta, the idea of vengeance, right? Which has always been a concept that intrigues me, precisely because of its ability to drown out sort of all factors of the world. So vengeance is an extremely rigid concept and an extremely flexible concept simultaneously, right? The person who typically, in terms of the what, where, when, why, how, vengeance almost has an unchanging concentration or an absolutism towards the who and the what. They know who did it and they know what was done. And they replay this kind of criminal offense or this violation inexorably in their consciousness, right? But then as for the how, when, and where that they're going to resiliently sort of get their due, that's wide open. And in fact, they're infinitely resilient in terms of going back to the drawing board. If they miss a shot, they try something else, a new schematic, and they're infinitely patient. There's a strange coldness that goes simultaneously and paradoxically with the urgency, you know? And the reason is because they have this almost calm, tranquil rage that tells them it's as good as over. I'm going to get them. I know it. There's absolutely no doubt whatsoever, uncertainty in their mind that they will ultimately seal the game, sort of, you know, in some way. It's just a formality or a technicality or an academic exercise to wonder when or how or where. But they remain inventively open to that. And actually, that's a kind of more cruel version of it. But I'm really interested in even mystics. There's certain mystical traditions that have this idea of what Henri Michaud in the 20th century will call folds. So Henri Michaud has this beautiful little text that I always like to quote from. It's one of the best things I've ever read. It's a scathing book of aphorisms called The Land of Magic. And in it, he just says very enigmatically, as he's prone to do without having to prove himself or qualify himself, he just says, each person has 22 folds. And by the way, Deleuze, this is where he gets it from. For those who don't know, they're the ancestries, right? It's from Michaud's concept of the folds. Each person has 22 folds, which are like masks or conceptual incarnations. At some point in your life, you're the thief, you're the runaway, the liar, the lover, whatever, right? And what happens is that when you exhaust your 22nd fold, you die. He says that's what we call death. And what distinguishes a magus, what distinguishes a great sorcerer in his mind, is the recognition of this finitude, of this countdown, that then causes you to want to enhance and elongate each successive fold of existence. This is why, people get this wrong, this is why elders are revered in mysticism. It's not the same unconditional ageism of the social world or of religious structures where the elderly are just, you know, sort of assumed wisdom. It's the realization that if you're a good mystic, and you're doing your existential aesthetic technique correctly toward the folds, then you should be escalating and improving the richness, the complexity, the intricacy, the stylization of each fold as you're counting down to the 22nd, which will be the annihilative one, which means you should die on top. You should die at your best hour, which is a hell of a concept. Nietzsche talks about this with the free death as well. He says, most die, it's a kind of brutal statement, but he says, some die too early, most die too late, which is a kind of condemnatory statement existentially. And he says, but the right ones know how to die at the right time. And that's a great art for him, which is to say, to die at the height of your intensity. That is not some magical thinking to me, sort of, that requires great abstraction. It just requires this kind of successive folding towards a countdown in which you make sure that then if you're not, this is the problem with Nietzsche's eternal return. He says, if you find out that then that you're at the archway of the moment, he says in Zarathustra, and you look forward, you sneak a glimpse sort of into the aftermath, and you see that the path is the same elongated into eternity. Most will fall into despair and consider this a tyranny of the same, right? And that's where they'll become nihilistic and they'll fall into the abyss. And he goes, that's not the problem of the eternal return. That's because you suck. If the idea of eternity is a hideous proposition to you, it's because you're failing the game. It's because you don't like the look of yourself. The person who is in love, madly in love on the night of their greatest infatuation, wants nothing more than that moment to last forever. The warrior on the battlefield, who is at the height of their abilities, wants nothing more than for that battle to last forever. That is a correct desiring machine attuned to sort of Nietzschean, if you want to call it, vitalism, or Nietzschean will to power. And I think that requires a certain understanding of the game in that way, sort of that each phase or each modality has to kind of cumulatively that's craft, that's aesthetics in the old sense. And I'm old fashioned in this way. I like the old guilds that teach that. I dislike the kind of contemporary hipster, everybody just does what they do, and yeah, I'm a poet, and on weekends I write in my blog. Oh my God, that's my nightmare. I avoid that like the plague, right? Maybe I'm old school in those hierarchies, but I think that's sort of the notion of the game there. And I think only a concept of mastery and discipleship oftentimes is what's necessary there, even towards oneself. If you read Nietzsche's kind of schizophrenic notions of becoming, read The Stillest Hour, he's talking to himself. And there's another version of him. So we do this just psychologically. When you're in the midst of a moment of doubt and you break into another voice, you go, all right, calm down, kid, take a moment. Who the hell is that talking to? You have created a schism where there is an elevated prototype of yourself that is the elder or the counselor, who is wiser somehow. That's a remarkable ability if we transfer that sort of to our philosophical, literary, aesthetic games, as well, and to the idea of becoming. So anyway, I won't go further than that. That's a lot to throw, but
thanks a lot, Jason. Just like to close shop if it's possible, and regarding what you just have said along Thomas, there's a question by one of our researchers, Martina Cavallot, and how we can, let's say, this question I think relates to how we can avoid the flattening of the game. If our gameplay stays inside the confines of the catching versus being caught, winning versus losing, creation versus apocalypse dialectics, does it perpetrate the ideology of the zero-sum game? What are the consequences of this totality of thought in extinction discourse? So I don't know who would like to chip in.
Yeah, I think yeah, again, I'd revert to what I said earlier on the idea of the desiderata being, in some sense, playing games where the stakes are internal to the game, I guess, and that I think that's like the kind of horizon of thought. Because I mean, there is this like in that kind of very telic discourse, that we were playing around earlier with Marx and the final revolution. There's also this prevalent idea of like death by perfection. So the idea, I mean, you find it in Charles Peirce, you find it in William James as well. The idea that the universe might end when it reaches this final consummatory moment, and it's just like I'm as happy as possible, and I want it to end here. It's this really nice idea. So I think those ideas are nice and romantic, but I like the idea. Yeah, I like the idea of the ability to kind of escape that dynamic of the zero-sum game, but still have the traction and the risk that makes the responsibility required for intentional consciousness to still be available via kind of egress into kind of paradisical games. I think that's a a nice kind of future vision, because you lose that intentional consciousness and you go into that death by perfection kind of zone where you might have reached the omega point, but it's stupider than the sludge. So what's the point? From the outside, that omega point looks no different from a death drive. So yeah, I think that's one way of escaping the zero-sum game, but still have the stakes required for consciousness to be meaningful.
Absolutely. I would agree with everything Thomas just said there. I also think that one way just perceptually to escape zero-sum instrumentalization, because zero-sum requires you to instrumentalize play as a means to an end. And if you become indifferent to that, and instead you just be consumed with the elegance of play, not with the result, not with the outcome, not with the so-called victor, you just want to be the greatest player in existence. And I actually would prescribe this to anyone listening who's in our tribe or in our trade of philosophy, literature, art, I honestly believe that if you don't think you're the greatest philosopher walking the planet or of all time, get out of the game. You're wasting your time and everyone else's. You should believe at any given moment that you're the greatest. The best did. And that's not arrogance. That is backbreaking humility. Because once you set yourself up for that type of destiny, you realize the work that is required to actually hold up that end of the deal. You realize you have to age yourself decades in your craft. You realize what it takes to go from point A to point B. If you're going to say, I'm going to write a more disturbing book than Kafka. Kafka is my outer limit of sort of turbulence, but I want to be even colder. I want to be more metallic. I want to be more disturbing. That's what Beckett did. So why not upend that? If you are not writing at this moment the book that you would most want to read in the bookstore or the library, then what are you doing? And so I think that's a way to get out of the zero sum too, is that, or you right into the heart of the zero sum. For me to be the greatest, then everyone else has to not be the greatest. But that's okay. Trust me that the best men and women of our trade would love that. Don't believe the kind of academic false humility. They all carried that. Read Kafka's diaries. As mousy and introverted and modest as you think he thought he was the greatest writer who ever walked the planet. And he should. He should. And I love the fact, the agony of this slender, disowned, poor person who died young, with his throat closing in on him and starving to death in a room by himself, knew that he was the absolute best. And call him on his damn bluff and see if he's not that good. He absolutely is. We should strive for that. We should, I think, aspire to that as well in the game, to be the best players of the game, win or lose. If you fall short, you still fall good in the end that way. Thank you, Federico, for this.
No, I would like to thank you both, Jason and Thomas. I think this was a really wonderful conversation. I think as the game, it could be projected to the infinite, but unfortunately we have finite time for now. So I would love another opportunity for keep this conversation going. So thanks a lot, Jason, once again. Thanks a lot, Thomas, the New Centre organizers, for putting this up. Once again, hoping for the future conversation where we can go in depth with this fascinating subject. And just a very brief technical announcement. We have for our sixth session, we have Aladdin Borioli for moderation, our researcher for the New Centre. This would be on Tuesday, 14th of July, with the guests Julieta Aranda and Ivan Kirksky. The subject will be human and non-human relationships, so everybody's invited to chip in, to give in their contributions, and we'll be expecting you all there. So thank you so much, Jason and Thomas.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.